Hi there, and welcome to What They Don't Teach You About July 4th. And I'm Christina Fry, and I'm a youth motivational speaker. I go around and share stories about our founding fathers that are really inspiring to create leaders today. So I'm thrilled to share with you some of the ins and outs and the secrets that people just don't seem to know about this holiday. And it's inspiring and it's fun. You might as well know why we celebrate this day and what it all means. So I'm going to be addressing that and much more. There's going to be some fun facts. You're going to learn why John Adams is the real hero of this day and not Thomas Jefferson. And there's going to be a funny story about Benjamin Franklin. He is a truly hilarious guy. And also, when we transitioned from, a government by Great Britain to a government by ourselves, that was a huge transition. How do you even do that? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. All right, here we go. What they don't teach you about July 4th. Now, let's see here. Who was the least likely person to write about history? Who could it be? That would be me. And the reason for that is I used to think that history was just filled with really negative, downer stories about wars and death. And, let's fixate on World War II because it's so inspiring. Yeah, not so much. But then I watched the HBO special, which, by the way, is running all day today. The John Adams miniseries, which if you haven't seen it, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And I realized, wow, not only are these founding fathers really human and funny and they make mistakes, but they're really inspiring too. So that history is not just filled with disaster. There's actually some good stuff there. So I read a bunch of books like the pile you see on this page. And and I was just like inundated with wonderful biographies about these guys and other books. I definitely have my favorite authors now, and I just dug in. And the result of that is this book. I found all the juicy stories about 5 of the founding fathers, and I created this book called 5 Rock Stars of the American Revolution. And it's just filled with, the good stories about these guys. Like what makes Paul Revere so important on the night before the revolution started, right? Or why was it that Ben Franklin could have so much fun at every single thing he ever did? Just he had a real talent for that. So that's all in there. And I'm going to show you the guts of the book. These are some of the guts. On the right-hand side, you'll see some of the stories, What? A silversmith? Are you kidding me? So that's Paul Revere. And then on the left-hand side, you see that there's some questions. So there's some good questions in there so you can really connect to these characters even more. That's the format of the book. All right. So before I'm going to tell you what exactly happened on July 4th, which I will tell you on that particular day in 1776, we'll get there. But for now, I wanted to just really look at who really cares about independence. What was the big deal about that? Well, we were governed by this guy, and his name was George III, and he had a parliament too, and he liked to wear very fancy crowns. And he was turning into a mean girl. Okay, not really a mean girl, but just he was getting mean and bossy. And, you heard about all the taxation without representation stuff, I'm sure. So not a happy guy, and we weren't that happy either, honestly. But at the same time, while that was happening, there were all these new ideas that were sort of brewing around in the background. And more people were getting excited about these ideas. Things like all men are created equal. Does that sound familiar? Or we should rule by the consent of the governed. Like a government should rule by the consent of the governed. We should vote for our leaders and they should listen to us. Oh yeah. That each of us has a right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness / property. That was sort of interchangeable. And then if the government is misbehaving, we get to replace it. All of these ideas were pretty darn radical at the time. No one had really put these into an implementation quite yet. And so the question was, hey, if these are new and radical ideas, could it actually be done? Could this fly? Was it possible? And I'm just going to throw at you the big headaches that they had. That's why it's such a busy slide. The first one is Great Britain was where we got our cool clothes, and our just all cool stuff came from Great Britain. So if we were going to cut off our ties with this country, no more ships with nice stuff on it. So if you were going to have a party, no fancy dishes or, a new saddle for your horse. You can just forget about all that stuff. Also, we would be totally open to other countries attacking us. Great Britain had a really big army and navy. Without their help, countries like France and Spain could just come right in and attack us. We also asked ourselves, because these were really smart folks, they asked, hey, if we get all this power, who's to say we're going to be better politicians than the corrupt British? Who knows? When people get a lot of power, they act differently. They get greedy, yeah, we see that happen. And then will our army, right, the Continental Army, will it take over our government? In pretty much the entire history of man, when a military leader got enough power with his army, if he won the war, they would just take over. And it was just weird that George Washington did not do that when he won the war at the end. Most people did, and people were afraid of that. So what about slavery, right? What in the world were we going to do about that situation? And finally, Great Britain has the best constitution on the planet. Yeah, so what makes us think we can do better than the British? And it was true. British citizens had more rights than any other person on the planet, and American colonists benefited from that. So you can tell there's a lot of stuff that we just wondered about. Could it fly? Okay, so now we know what the big concerns are. Why don't we take a look at the Declaration's ideas and where they came from? Because maybe you're thinking that Thomas Jefferson was this totally brilliant man who just came up with these ideas out of his head and no one else could have come close to all these great ideas. Well, that was not the case at all. One of the cool things about this era is that they were all reading philosophers and brilliant historians who, it was almost like they were swimming in this wonderful soup of ideas. And so some of them were particularly downloaded into the Declaration, and I'd like to share with you from whom or from whence they came. The first one, I call them game changers. And of course, they were in Jefferson's brain. So the first one is the adorable old Saxons. The old Saxons, aren't they so cute? Okay, these are not really the old Saxons, but I stole that from the Lord of the Rings movie because they didn't have horses, but they did look like this. The old Saxons had a total hold on Jefferson's brain. Jefferson thought that they were the coolest people ever. Why? Because they were peaceful, number one. They weren't going around fighting all the time, although they were strong, and if they needed to fight, they could have. They also had a life around farming. That's what they focused on. Again, not war. They had an egalitarian or equal leadership, kind of like a round table or a town meeting. And they had dignity. So it wasn't like there was this evil, greedy king who was bossing everyone around saying, I want your land and I want your money. Give it to me now, which is a lot of what the Norman kings ended up doing. So the Saxons were a little bit more civilized, at least according to Jefferson. And his point was that if the Saxons could do it, then the Americans sure as heck could, right? Wasn't that new? The funny thing about this story, and I talk about this in my book, is that it turns out that it was really new, and this hadn't happened. The Saxons were just as power hungry as the Normans, but of course that didn't come out until way after Jefferson and everyone else had died. So the point is, the story worked, they used it as proof, and that's that. All right, 4 more game changers. Francis Bacon is the next one, and although he came way before Jefferson, his idea was, I can see things for myself, thank you very much. Now that sounds super obvious, I know, but here's the opposite of that and what was more the norm at the time, which is you need to bow down to a priest or a king or both at the same time to understand what life meant and to understand what your role was in society. If you had any important questions, you needed to go outside of yourself to these authority figures and ask them. And if you're Francis Bacon and you say something like, I see things for myself and I can figure stuff out, I don't need to go ask a priest or some king for the right answers to everything. I can have that power myself. So you see where I'm going with this, right? It gives the power back to the individual and the citizen. All right, thank you, Francis. The next one is John Locke, who was a real heartthrob in his day. No, he wasn't. But he was, this was his philosophy. I am a rock star, just like the King of England. He didn't exactly use those words, but he said that no matter where you were born or who you were born to, that you had just as much brilliance and or no brilliance as anybody else. You were a clean slate. Okay, it didn't matter who you were born into. So this was the opposite of the norm, which was, hey, I was born a king, therefore I'm super cool, and you need to bow down to me. Thanks. And you were born poor, so you're worth nothing, and you're not very smart. There was this assumption that, if you're born poor, it's too bad for you, and yeah. But John Locke said, no, it doesn't matter who you're born unto. Everybody is born with a clean slate. Moving on to Mr. Montesquieu from France. He was a wealthy aristocrat, believe it or not, and he noticed that people got really greedy when they had too much power. So he wanted to see a separation of powers that would keep each other in check. So if, the king or the executive got too much, like a little crazy, then the legislature or the parliament could keep him in check, or the judges, judiciary, right? So that whole concept. That came from Montesquieu. The opposite of that is what I call the Jabba the Hutt blob of power model, which is when everything is sort of congealed and you've got your executive, legislative branch and your judicial branch in one spot. Not so great, because if we don't like what the legislative branch is doing, you can't really go to the executive if they're, together in it. And the last game changer I will mention, because there were a lot of them, but the last one today is Francis Hutcheson. Not a well-known guy. And he happened to be a Scottish philosopher who was a fabulous speaker. He could make everybody cry just giving them a pound cake recipe, kind of like Patrick Henry. And his whole philosophy was that people are good, which means you can trust them. Mankind is naturally benevolent and really wants everyone in his life to do well or her life to do well. The opposite of this, of course, is don't trust anyone because they're all evil or they could be evil, so they don't deserve any rights. We need to keep them low and imprisoned, like just don't. And again, looking at the opposite, people are good, that's totally different when you look at Hutcheson's philosophy. And Jefferson absolutely loved Hutcheson, just like he loved the old Saxons, because it meant the ordinary folk were perfectly capable of being trusted, and especially to create their own government. So you take all these game changers and you distill them down into a magic potion that is called the Declaration of Independence. Ta-da! Yay! Jefferson did a happy dance when he was done. Okay, so now we're going to talk about why John Adams is such a rock star. And, it's probably worth mentioning that Jefferson was very, very quiet during those few months leading up to the signing of, or the ratifying of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th. He just observed. But Adams was in the trenches. He was getting it done. And most notably, when you say to a country like Great Britain, I'm done, I'm going to go have my own government, you need to know how to stop one form of government and start another one. Like transitioning in this huge way is scary. So I now present you John Adams's foolproof plan to kick the British out and start a new country. And there are 6 steps. Number 1, and to me the most important, which is establish state governments. Now, a lot of these state governments at the time had charters, but of course they were all issued by the King of England, and that's where they got their authority from. So it was like, throw that out the window, but we need to have another, something in place to replace it. And luckily for everybody at the Continental Congress, John Adams was the best guy for this job. He knew how to create a brilliant governmental structure in a way that allowed a lot more freedom and equality without giving it too much away, because they were also very aware that if you give the people too much power, that can be scary too. So these were things he thought about a lot, and he was really good at putting a structure in place that would work. So everybody came to John and they said, hey, John, can you please help me with my constitution? Like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, whoever. And he helped them. So he was responsible for a lot of their constitutions. And he ended up making the oldest constitution still in the world today, the one of Massachusetts Commonwealth. So that was step number 1. Step number 2 is let's come together and create a confederation. We need to unify. We've got a lot in common, and we'll be a lot stronger together than apart. And one of the reasons for that is step number 3, because we need to establish relationships with other countries. They're not going to want to have a treaty with, let's have a treaty with Virginia, and then another one with Georgia, and then another one with Connecticut. It's like, no, they're not going to waste their time. So we need to come together so that they can treat us as one strong country. This happened in 1781, so it took a while, but, we got it done. And then we sent people over, our diplomats, which I picture here on the screen. Thomas Jefferson is on top. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin are on the bottom. And they all went to Paris to beg for money, pretty much, and to establish treaties with the King of France. And this, of course, led to much partying on Franklin's behalf. Franklin knew how to have a really good time. All right, step number 4, I believe, is disarm your enemies. Now, you might wonder, okay, yeah, isn't that so obvious because we're fighting a war? But as a matter of fact, a lot of people in America did not want the war. They still supported King George III, and they were called the Loyalists or the Tories. And they were very clearly not in agreement to American independence. So we need to disarm the people who are not on our side, right? Pretty obvious. All right, number 5 is to protect the waters. Protect the waters. Why would that be? Well, if you look back, I'm just going to go back here to the map. This is, these are the colonies right here. And as you can see, most of the major cities, like if you're thinking New York, New Haven, Boston, Providence, and a lot of the Virginia areas, and even Philadelphia, which sits on a river, all of them are accessible by water. And if we were not protected in our waters, that would mean that these scary ships could just come right up to us and take over, which they did in a couple of instances, like New York and almost Philadelphia. And then last but not least, let's sign a declaration and make it official. Let's do it. So that was step number 6. So that is John Adams's foolproof plan to have, voila, a new country. Thank you, John. All right, now I'm going to take a moment to pause for a commercial break and tell you a story about the funny Benjamin Franklin. This is Benjamin Franklin, again, from the John Adams special. Such a huge fan of that. So Benjamin Franklin had a lot of money, and the reason for that is that he was a very successful printer in Philadelphia. He printed an almanac called Poor Richard's Almanac, which was super funny, and everyone had to have a copy of this. So he became very wealthy from that. Now, with his wealth and success, he had a lot of competitors, and one of them, whose name was Titan Leeds, went around telling people not to do business with Benjamin Franklin, that he was not to be trusted, he was a bad man, this and that and the other thing, not a nice man. And Benjamin Franklin heard about this. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have been pretty upset by this kind of treatment. And Benjamin Franklin, I'm sure, wasn't too thrilled. But instead of going over to Titan Leeds' shop and sort of threatening him or telling him to stop it or maybe shoving him around a little bit, Benjamin Franklin decided to play a trick on Titan Leeds. And what he did was he printed a story in his almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac, that Titan Leeds was going to die on a certain day and time, and even to the hour. Now, Franklin was laughing his head off about this, as was most of Philadelphia. Everyone got a kick out of this joke. Titan Leeds, however, was not amused. And he went off on another rampage on Benjamin Franklin, telling everyone, oh, he's such a jerk, and I can't stand him, and this is not fair. Look what he does. And Benjamin Franklin printed another letter, and he said, this is from Titan Leeds' sorry, back up. He said in his almanac, wow, Titan Leeds must be dead, because the real Titan Leeds would never say such a thing. He would never be that rude to us. So, yeah. So more laughs, and everyone's buying his almanac, and everything's going great. And a few years pass, and Titan Leeds dies. For real. And this is about 4 years after the predicted date. Now, does Benjamin Franklin let this go? No. He prints another thing in his almanac, and this time from Titan Leeds' ghost, saying, I would like to set the record straight and say that Benjamin Franklin was right. I did die on that date he predicted. And I just wanted to tell you that now. So Benjamin Franklin, instead of going over there and roughhousing and threatening his opponent, he used it and as fodder for his own, for selling more almanacs. So, and for making everyone, including himself, laugh. All right, there you have it. Little commercial break, courtesy of Benjamin Franklin. Okay, so not everybody wanted independence. Yeah, true, right? We already talked about those loyalists. So about a third wanted independence, a third didn't want independence, and a third didn't really care either way. They just didn't really want a war, obviously. And this was a big problem for George Washington. George Washington was the commanding general of the Continental Army. And the way that it was set up is that if you were a soldier, you signed up for 1 year. And then if you didn't feel like continuing your service, you could just leave. And the only reason people stuck around or even joined in the first place is that they were on board and they believed in independence. And sometimes when George Washington was losing, he would start losing his soldiers because they could just leave if they wanted to. So this whole thing about who really wanted independence or who didn't really impacted George Washington and his army, because the more people who wanted it, clearly there would be more soldiers in the army and vice versa. So, by the way, I talk about that a lot in my book. George Washington, I don't know how he did it. He had amazing challenges. And yet, check out what he did, right? Totally won that war. He actually lost 6 out of 9 major battles in that war. So, but he still won. Kind of cool. All right, let's finally talk about the day itself. Woohoo! All right, so what the heck happened on July 4th? And by the way, the picture on the screen is from my favorite video. My favorite video called Too Late to Apologize, a Declaration. So Too Late to Apologize. It's a music video with the Founding Fathers about the Declaration. It is hilarious. Please go watch it when you have a chance. All right, so what actually happened? I'm going to answer that first by saying not much. In fact, we're putting this baby to sleep even talking about it. I'm going to back up just a little bit to the 2 important days before July 4th, and then we'll talk about July 4th. So it took John Adams a long time to convince the other colonies that, yes, it's time for us to break ties with Great Britain and declare our independence. There was a lot of back and forthing, letters to the colonial legislatures. I mean, just, yeah, it took a while. But finally, on May 15th, 1776, they all came together and a preamble was signed stating that all attempts at reconciliation were going to be stopped. They were done being nice to King George III. They were done being nice to the Parliament. And that was it. They were all unified in that decision. And John Adams was so moved by this that he thought this would be the big day. May 15th, let's give it up. And he called it the most important resolution that was ever taken in America. And on May 20th, it was read out loud, just kind of, like the Declaration was. It was read to thousands in Philadelphia. But it was not the big day. Then, more discussions, more, they're drafting the Declaration, lots is happening, la, la, la. And then on July 2nd, the last colony, South Carolina, their representatives show up, and it turns out they also are ready to approve independence. Okay, this is a little different from the whole cutting ties with Great Britain thing. So they're all approving independence on July 2nd. And John Adams makes this amazing speech. It's very emotional. And they finally vote. And they vote unanimously for independence, with New York abstaining. But that was not the big day. And July 4th is when Jefferson's declaration, which I'm calling the memo, and I'll tell you why in a second. His memo is presented, and it had been ripped to shreds the day before, a couple of days before. It was edited by a lot of the people at the Continental Congress, which totally broke Jefferson's heart, but there you have it. And then on July 4th, it was ratified. So I'm just making the distinction that on July 2nd, independence itself was approved. On July 4th, the memo, the actual written document for that, was approved. So two different things. Now, in order to prove to you how insignificant July 4th actually was, I'm going to show you a couple of pieces of information. Jefferson and Adams were two very busy journal writers. They wrote in their journals all the time, especially on important days in history. They kind of knew in their mind that they were up to something important, and they liked to leave a paper trail behind. So isn't it interesting that on July 4th, this is what they write? So Jefferson writes about, wait for it, buying some ladies' gloves and a thermometer. Woo, that's exciting, right? And John Adams writes nothing, like absolutely nothing at all. So I'm wondering how important they actually thought that day was, if there's nothing there that they recorded, really. July 6th, there were celebrations in Philadelphia. July 9th, George Washington receives it and reads it to his troops in New York City just before he's about to get his butt kicked by the British 3 times in a row. Poor George. And then on August 2nd, it was signed. Everyone thinks, oh, look, we signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Woohoo! Not the case. One person signed it on July 4th. That was John Hancock, the guy with the really big signature. Everyone else signed it on August 2nd or thereabouts. You have to remember that this was such a nutty time. People were coming and going, and if they could get to Philadelphia, they were lucky. So yeah, there was a lot of back and forthing going on. All right, so I'm going to talk about why the Declaration was not that big of a deal at first, and then what happened. When Jefferson was given the task, and it was really a committee that did it, but he was the one writing it, there was thought put into it. I mean, it did matter somewhat, especially since, independence was important. So it's not like he just scribbled it off to just make sure we remembered we were independent. And of course, he's the most amazing writer ever, writing the 55 most famous and important words in the history of America. I mean, let's be honest. Well, it was just not that important. No one really referred to it for years afterwards. and certainly not as some document to revere and have respect for and get all excited about. And at the time, as you could see, like with all of his planning and work, John Adams was the real hero of independence. And by the way, his pen is on fire in this particular image because John Adams had a really hilarious habit of arguing with all the authors that he would read. So he would sit there reading a book and he would make lots of notes in the margins and just argue back and forth like, I'm not really sure I agree with that, and here's what I think, and like, yeah. So he was a very active and passionate reader. And frankly, I'm all for it. And I myself have become a little bit more, in your face as a reader when I go through a book. All right. But then what happened was when we started to become a real country, so when the Constitution was written 11 years later, and all those beautiful ideas in the Declaration started to look like, hey, we're actually using these ideas. This is for real. We are creating a government where all men are created equal, and we are going to have rule by the consent of the governed. Then Jefferson's star started rising. And when he got famous, he started wearing these really cool glasses to just make sure everybody knew how cool he was. Yeah, that's not really true. Okay. Now, I have a couple weird fun facts about July 4th. And we're just about finishing up here. So if you have any questions, again, don't be shy. I will unmute at the end and we can have a little chit chat. So first of all, Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, on July 4th, 1826, which is strangely 50 years exactly after the Declaration was not really signed. And then it was not hot. Everyone walks around talking about, oh, these guys, this really hot summer. They were doing the Declaration. It wasn't that hot. It was hot the summer they created the Constitution 11 years later, but not in 76. And then the Declaration did not start the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was already happening. It had been for a year plus. That had started in Lexington and Concord, thanks to Paul Revere, sort of. All right. Again, I talk more about that in my book. Now, if you're wondering, wow, I'd really love to find out more about how cool George Washington is, because personally, I talked a lot about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, but Washington had a lot going on for independence. And, I talk a lot about that. I couldn't talk about everything today. So that's all in the book. Check it out. It's on Amazon. I've got a Kindle version, you name it. And also, please, 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 it's on cable right now since it is July 4th today. John Adams, the miniseries is fabuloso. Really, really great. And I would say, like, if you're 10 years old or more than that you're good. Like, you'll enjoy it. And I would love to hang out with you on Facebook and Twitter, so go find me, please. And I also have a website. So, yeah, that is that. Now, if you have any questions, now would be a good time. I'm actually going to stop the recording.